So Vanessa Guigneri is professor of contemporary British and postcolonial literature at the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon, and she is the president of the Société d'études anglaises contemporaines. Her research interests include the poetics of voice and silence, generic transformations, fragmentation, and genetic criticism. She is the author of monographs on Julian Barnes, including Julian Barnes from the Margins, Exploring the Writer's Archives in 2020, B.S. Johnson in 2009, Ben Okri in 2012, and Jonathan Coe in 2015. She is the editor or co-editor of 15 collections of essays on contemporary British and postcolonial literature, notably on Ben Okri, Janet Frame, Nadine Gordimer, and Carol Phillips, and has edited several volumes of interviews with writers, including Conversations with Ben Okri in 2024. In 2022 and 2024, she conducted research on the representation of manual workers in contemporary Indian fiction and nonfiction at the Centre de Sciences Humaines in New Delhi.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I would like to thank, of course, the organizers for inviting me to this conference, and thank Pooja Chongoiwala for being here. And I'm very much looking forward to this day of talk on her work. And I would like to thank the people who are online as well. I saw two of my PhD students there, so I'm very happy that Lyon is represented. So how do I click the, okay, okay. So in the author's note to Homebound, which is dated the 17th of May 2020 at the start and the 20th of August 2021 at the end, Pooja Chongoiwala, who signs the note, speaks in her own name and in the first person about the resilience, courage, and sobering hope of India's internal migrant workers who attempted to walk back to their rural homes during the COVID pandemic. As the migrants' mass departure to their rural homes mass departure from the cities gave these unseen and unheard and yet essential communities sudden visibility, Pooja Chongoiwala realized that their exodus belonged to history. And she wanted to make sure that their ordeals would not be forgotten, as she writes in the note. I quote, "I wanted to seal their cold realities in ink, ensure that we never drown them into oblivion." She thus describes Homebound as her attempt at documenting their story. Her first instinct as the author of two non-fiction books as a journalist who has reported on India's informal economy and the workers who pillar it was, I quote, "to write a true account, relaying the journeys of a few migrant workers as they marched home." And this is what she partly does in the author's note, which starts with the mention of an authentic migrant worker. And you can see that on the left-hand side of the slide. I'm going to read that first sentence. "Surrounded by a sea of migrant workers like himself, Gaurav, whose name I've changed to prevent further persecution, stood in the blistering heat of Gujarat, awaiting a bus that the state had promised would take him home." The note goes on to provide context, dates, precise figures, and details that one might find in a work of journalism. And Pooja Chongoiwala did publish a very well-informed article on the situation of the slum dwellers during the COVID pandemic on the 12th of May 2020 in the New Arab, entitled "India's Coronavirus Response Ignores Its Slum Dwellers, All 65 Million of Them." So note that the article was published 5 days before the opening date of the author's note in Homebound. Now, in addition to this news article, and for reasons that Pooja explains in the author's note and that she developed in her talk today, she chose fiction as another medium to keep a trace of the migrants' experiences and to ensure that their sudden visibility would not dissipate. So my aim in this paper today is to tentatively read Homebound through the notion of archive. And this is part of a research project I'm currently conducting on the representation of underprivileged manual workers in Indian contemporary literature in English. As part of this project, I'm working on Aman Sethi's A Free Man, A True Story of Life and Death in Delhi, which is a literary reportage about the homeless daily construction workers in Old Delhi. And I'm working also on Mridula Ghosh's novel Bicycle Dreaming, which relates a year in the life of the teenage daughter of a Muslim waste buyer in South Delhi. And the character, this teenage character, like Meher in Homebound, becomes aware of the unfair treatment of underprivileged people. So my aim is to examine to what extent books of fiction and non-fiction about invisibilized manual workers in India may constitute an archive or a counter-archive of the present in their representation of usually unrecorded and unarchived people and events. And as you see, I'm calling it an archive of the present to point to the fact that the trace that is being preserved is of people in the present, so that their condition may be known in the present and then remembered in the future. Sealed, to quote Pooja again, sealed in ink so that we never drown them into oblivion. Now, these traces that are kept may be called archives of the commons. And here I'm borrowing the title of a series of seminars that were organized in Madrid in 2015 and 2017 and concentrated on the traces left by marginalized and subaltern populations and of the various ways of keeping those traces. So my paper today is a very sketchy, preliminary and tentative step, and you'll see that it has more questions than answers. So I will briefly define what I understand by archives in the plural and in the singular. And I will then say a few words about the relation of journalism and nonfiction to the archive, plural and singular. And finally, I will show in which ways Homebound may be considered as archiving the present, as long as we agree to redefine the concept of archive. So archives in the plural traditionally refer to documents out of common use, collected, catalogued, and preserved to serve the history of a community or an individual, and to the place where these archives are preserved. You see that this definition highlights the fact that archives are governed by a logic of classification, and they're supposed to enable the constitution of an official archive, while their position out of common use leads to their being assigned a protected and fixed space, sometimes away from public inspection, hence my question about the government documents that were only accessible to journalists. So placed in a fixed space and in a fixed time. The archives, in their materiality as paper, manuscripts, recorded sound and images, but also in digital form, are a functional lieu de mémoire and a storage agency, to quote Wolfgang Ernst, which may then be turned into a narrative. So that's archives in the plural. On the other hand, several theoreticians, including Arlette Farge in Le Goût de l'Archive, but also before her, Michel Foucault, have decided to use the noun in the singular. And Foucault calls archive in the singular the mass of things in a culture preserved, valorized, reused, repeated, and transformed. So you see the archive in the singular is a broader and more fluid concept which can be understood as a metaphor and a virtual space, which supposes therefore a more inclusive view of records and record keeping. In moving the margins to the middle, reconciling the archive with the archives, Jeanette Bastien defined the archive in the singular as, I quote, a site of both community identity and self-realization, a monolithic accumulation of knowledge on the one hand, a sponge-like fluidity of information on the other, a particular location but with no fixed address, a place of affect and emotion, and importantly, a context for evidence and memory. You see how these conception of the archive is very encompassing, and it needs to be understood in relation to what has been called the archival turn that took place in the mid to late 20th century in several disciplines, and which relied on a more expansive understanding of what may constitute an archive. And that understanding of archive includes memory, witnessing, materiality, but also performance, art, gestures, etc. This turn to the archive also aimed to reveal the gaps, omissions, and silences in official archives, and to encourage one to read the archives against the grain by looking for what is not apparent at first glance. Boaventura de Sousa Santos thus refers to the palimpsest archive and to the act of, I quote, scraping the surface of what the archive shows in order to identify the marks, traces, shadows, and silences of what was destroyed or produced as absent, invisible, and irrelevant in the process of building the archivable world. Saidiya Hartman also invites us to speculate from the silences and absences of the archives, a process she names critical fabulation, or history written with and against the archive. So in relation to this conception of the archive, in Homebound, one may think of the story related by Meher about the man murdered by his wife and her lover, whose body was dismembered and thrown into the river. Although his age and professional status as a worker in a wax printing unit and the identity of his killers were known, the man's name remains unknown. And because the man was poor and he was an orphan whom no one missed when he died, he failed to appear on news reports and was turned into an unidentified body whom nobody would grieve and mourn, thus being silenced in the archive. He became, I quote, an unidentified body murdered by unidentified persons over unidentified reasons. Case closed. The fact that only parts of his disremembered body were recovered from the river seems to reflect the incompleteness of the archive. Only Meher's report of this story acts as a memorialization of the man. In the same way, Meher memorializes the unnamed migrant worker who was thrown out of a truck on his way home because he probably had COVID. Although Meher's family had to leave him by the road, probably to die, Meher notes, my disobedient mind refused to leave him behind, thus keeping a trace of him in her mind and on her page. So as I mentioned before, my aim in my research project is to wonder whether literature, fictional or non-fictional, may act as an archive or a counter-archive of the present through its preservation and transmission of the memory of usually unarchived and unrecorded current events, practices, and ordinary lives of the kind that I've just mentioned through this example. I'm calling it a counter-archive, as it sometimes entails operating against the grain of dominant discourses. These dominant discourses might be official documents, there might be news reports, there might be reports of governmental organs, of course, dominant discourses that may later become official archives that will be transmitted to later generations. So we see here to what extent the archive is very much related to power and politics. As Derrida argues, there is no political power without control of the archive, if not memory. So when Pooja Changaiwala writes that she wants to seal the migrants' cold realities in ink and to document their story, I would like to argue that even as a novelist, she acts as an archivist, so as to keep a trace of unreported and unarchived populations and events, and that she and other writers do so by redefining what an archive might be and what it might include. So before exploring further this redefinition of the archive, I'd first like to get back to the question of literary genre that Pooja addressed in her talk, to wonder what type of text may constitute an archive. As Pooja reminded us earlier on, she published her debut novel Homebound in 2021, But before that, she wrote 2 books of nonfiction, The Front Page Murders and Gangster on the Run, which are examples of the invigorating development of literary nonfiction in India in the first decades of the 21st century. So part of my research consists in wondering whether such non-fictional literary productions may be said to constitute an archive of the present, and in exploring to what extent the type of archive they provide differ from what is conveyed in, for instance, news reports or shorter journalistic pieces, which Pooja also writes and publishes. In Homebound, the teenager Meher writes letter to the journalist Miss Farah, hoping that she would report on the expedition in her news articles and thereby give visibility to the migrant workers walking home. These migrant workers who, even when they strain their raspy voices, vocalizing their fear, anguish, and despair, are loud, so loud, but unheard. 3 different traces are evoked here. On the one hand, letters, which can, of course, constitute an archive, journalistic reports, which may also constitute an archive, and finally, the voices of the distressed migrant workers, which, however loud, remain unheard, a word that is all the more powerful for being isolated between 2 full stops at the end of a paragraph, after the vain repetition of loud, so loud. So can these loud, so loud, but unheard voices be archived in news article? And can the latter constitute a non-official archive of the present? Meher refers at some point to the barrage of news reports telling stories about millions like us who had set out on foot for their villages. So these stories do exist, they are reported. She often relies on news reports for her own knowledge, and she transcribes the interview of a brick kiln worker by a reporter. However, some of these reports can be rapidly outdated and then forgotten. The paper or digital format of some of these news reports may enable their preservation, but also cause their disappearance, as even the digital format does not guarantee preservation. Some other news reports may be politically oriented and sometimes convey false information. In Homebound, Meher refers to WhatsApp and social media messages which conspire to alter reality, warp lives, and spread digital falsities. And she also refers to the internet, which is, of course, a form of archive, as a web of lies. One may also think of the episode of the choreographed pictures of the politician handing food to the migrants, which will become an official archive, while on the other hand, Saliha's painstaking work with the NGO remains unseen, although it is archived by Meher in the book. Another type of archive might be long-form narrative journalism, which in India can be found in such publication as Caravan, The Caravan, a Delhi magazine, or Outlook, which has regularly published Arundhati Roy's long essays. And the issue you can see on the right of the slide here is from June 2020 and focuses on the migrants who marched back to their villages during the lockdown. In book form, what Maitreyi Basu calls literary journalism about marginalized subjects occupies an important place, as you can see from such original books of fiction and nonfiction as the ones you can see on the slide. These books are emblematic of the writer's efforts to renew the conventions of nonfiction and the modes of writing about disenfranchised people whose lives often go unrecorded and unarchived. So what kind of archive of the present these various productions offer is one of the questions I'm asking. To get back to Pooja Chongoiwala's work, the style of some parts of the author's note in Homebound may be said to partake of the type of journalism that was published in the June 2020 issue of Outlook, or in Pooja Chongoiwala's own journalism, of which you can read a selection on her website. As in the issue of Outlook, and as is the case in many journalistic pieces, Pooja Chongoiwala humanizes the topic in the author's note by focusing on a few specific people among those she interviewed during the course of her research for the book. For instance, the renamed Gaurav, a migrant worker who ended up in prison after waiting for a bus that was supposed to take him back home, or the unnamed elderly lady willing to walk for 100 kilometers to reach her home. For her novel, the methods Pooja used drew from her experience as a journalist, as she reminded us, as she visited the highways in and around Mumbai to witness the migrant exodus for herself. And she went to many villages in Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Rajasthan. As she reminded us, she talked to many migrant workers, but also NGOs, villagers, lawyers, police officers, and migrant specialists. In the author's note, Pooja Chongoiwala also provides precise figures, for instance, of the 991 lockdown-related non-COVID deaths until the 30th of July 2020, citing unofficial documentation. Unofficial because the Indian government has been very reluctant to disclose the number of COVID and non-COVID deaths, and therefore the accuracy of official statistics has been questioned. This is a topic that Pooja addresses herself in an article published in July 2020 entitled Why South Asia's COVID-19 Numbers Are So Low for Now. By providing such unofficial documentation in the author's note, Pooja Chongoiwala is archiving what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls a non-official and non-authorized present. Now, my contention is that she also archives a non-official and a non-authorized present in the novel, and that fiction may offer different ways of archiving the present if we agree on a redefinition of what constitutes an archive. So in my last point, I will make a few suggestions as to the ways in which archive and archives may be redefined by drawing from a few concepts developed by theoreticians. For my research project, I drew from the concept of insurgent or counter-hegemonic archive coined by de Sousa Santos. He argues that the insurgent archive breaks with the archive form by scattering it through a multiplicity of sites and kinds of practices that aim to archive, even if in an ephemeral form, a non-official and non-authorized present. A dense present whose strength comes from claiming a suppressed past. So I'm arguing that what is claimed is not only a suppressed past, but also a suppressed present, when categories of populations are unheard, as mentioned earlier, unseen, ignored in the present. And this reminds me of a passage in Arundhati Roy's essay, The Pandemic is a Portal, from April 2020, when she quotes a carpenter who planned to walk all the way to the Nepal border because the lockdown suddenly decreed by Modi was condemning him to unemployment, homelessness, and starvation. This is exactly what Homebound is about. And the carpenter told Roy, maybe when Modiji decided to do this, that is, decide the lockdown only within 4 hours, nobody told him about us. Maybe he doesn't know about us. And Roy adds, us means approximately 460 million people. These are essential people to India's economy who remain unarchived and unreported, and whom Modi didn't know about when he gave a 4-hour notice to the lockdown. So how can they be known about? How can they be archived and reported? What are the multiple sites and practices mentioned by de Sousa Santos that may archive their present? Maybe their trace can be kept through an insurgent and counter-hegemonic archive of the type provided by the teenager Meher in her letters to the journalist. And it's interesting that in the novel, at some point, Meher refers to my insurgent body. She uses that word. Her rebellious spirit, which has grown over her journey home, can clearly be perceived in her last letter to the journalist, and in its very powerful last 3 pages, marked by anaphora, rhetorical questions, and accumulation that convey the depth of her outrage and despair, but also her emergence as a writer and maybe an archivist. After the anaphora of "I am tired" and her rhetorical questions starting with "How do I hope?" and "Must I argue?", Meher concludes by defining what home is through the anaphora of its where. Although Meher uses preterition to tell the journalist she will not endeavor to prove the humanity of migrant workers and will not make arguments about the worth and grievability of their lives, she does keep a trace of them through her enumerations. And she registers what all these workers do and perform in a very powerful one-sentence paragraph, which testifies to the extent of their humanity and social commitment. As with many archives of the unheard and the voiceless, however, we learn at the end of the afterword that after Meher died from COVID, her notebook, where she wrote her 11 letters, was buried with her, thereby placing her, that history on a deep and hidden layer of the palimpsest archive that will require scraping the surface to discover it. Among the other ephemeral forms of this insurgent and counter-hegemonic archive figure what have been called the anarchive or anarchival practices, which record the processual, affective, and embodied aspect of lived experience that traditional archives tend to leave aside. The anarchive is a supplement to the archive, which is not contained in a single object or collection, with the prefix ana meaning above, against, but also upside down and wrong. And of course, we may hear anarchy as well in an archive. For instance, in the archive and the repertoire, of course, there are many forms of an archive practices, but in the archive and the repertoire, for instance, Diana Taylor argues that the repertoire of embodied memory in performance, in gestures, in dance, in song, can offer an alternative to official written archives. I'll take one example from Homebound. In Homebound, but there are many others, of course, in Homebound, attention is paid to the body and to the scars and traces left on the body of underprivileged people. Thus, Meher recalls the body of Kalu Uncle, a farmer in Rajasthan who committed suicide because he could not pay his debts back. Meher, as an 8-year-old girl, focused on his ebony skin as he hung from a tree. His body glistening in the afternoon sun, as if a million stars danced on his flesh, as if the universe had cast a spotlight on him, cheering him as he put on a show. Momentarily, in the mind of the 8-year-old girl, the man is not the destitute, obscure farmer everyone will forget about, but a star placed in a spotlight that remain in the girl's memory. Likewise, Meher records the trembling and coughing body of the man thrown out of the truck and the suffering and starving bodies of the migrant workers beaten or drenched with chemicals by the police. So to conclude, in addition to the redefinitions of the archive I have sketchily suggested above, and there are many others, I just chose a few, one of the reasons for which I'm proposing to consider Homebound and other contemporary works of fiction and non-fiction as an archive or counter-archive is for the way they may offer truthful representations of the present. As mentioned earlier, Pooja wrote that her first instinct was to write a true account relaying the journeys of a few migrant workers as they marched home. And I would like to argue that although she wrote a novel, she did propose a true account because, as she quoted in her talk earlier today, she stayed true to the narrative and to the humans who inspired it. No imagined atrocities, no made-up brutalities, no fictional victories, just what happened, just what really happened. She stayed true because she did not propose what Aman Sethi called a narrative of objectivity, which he defined as the tendency for narratives about the working class to deliberately and thoughtlessly describe entire ways of life as abject. Okay, she doesn't do that. Nor does she propose what Lisa Lau calls a narrative of aspiration, which would have entailed, and I quote from the author's note, letting Meher live, flourish, become the journalist she wanted to become. That, as mentioned at the end of the author's note, would have defied the cardinal rule she set for her book. It would have meant being dishonest to her story and to the truth. The novel and fiction may therefore be some of the sites and practices that can archive a non-official and non-authorized present, because, to quote Pujat Changoiwala, fiction is the safer way to say the truth. From the website.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for this brilliant talk. And for the very useful terminology archives, because I know John is organizing a workshop on working on archives, and I don't know if he thought about plural or singular. I'm sure he did. And now I understand your question, the question you asked to Pooja. Yes. I was, just to start the conversation, I was thinking about D'Souza statement about the different practices that aim to archive. And you gave examples of letters or the body or scars. Does one need to print or record or photograph in order to preserve these things, or is it not necessary? Truthful fiction like Pooja's does the job of preserving it. This is what your talk was about, right?
Yes, what I'm suggesting is there are different forms of archiving. So I'm not saying that, you know, we should choose between the different forms of archive. So there can be, you know, printed archives, there can be photographs, there can be oral recordings, or there can be archives that do not leave any trace. That is, I don't know, oral storytelling that has not been either recorded or put to print. That was, I was referring to that very powerful scene in your novel of the man hanging from a tree. Meher has one vision at that point when she sees the light and she just sees that body as a star, and it's very ephemeral. And then, of course, it disappears because then she understands what is really taking place. You know, the man has committed suicide, but that's also an archive. So that's why it can be very immaterial, an archive. And that's also what Diana Taylor does in her book about the repertoire, that performance can be an archive, yes, even though there might be no trace, there might be no recording of a performance.
I don't know if Pooja has questions about this or...
Well, thank you, because your book really inspired me and actually was part of the research that I'm doing. So it confirmed some of my hypotheses. And I did not think of any of this. No, of course, yes. I'm glad I got it right. You did.
Thank you. Thanks, Vanessa. Really appreciate it. Yeah, the notions of archives, it's a good approach. One of the questions that I'd like to ask you, I mean, we meet in the archives, and the work that we generally do, of course, is looking at the archives as a voice from beyond, from the past as well. The voice doesn't change. We interpret the voice differently. Here you're talking about something that's living, of course, yes, a living archive. In terms of the archives that I'm doing right now, for instance, it's what's interesting is how we construct the archive. So when you and I go to an archive, the archive is there for us, yes, to explore. But what I'm doing right now for the project that Monica mentioned is partly constructing our own archive. Yes. But in doing so, the danger that I feel I'm having is I'm creating something permanent for someone in the future, but I'm biased as much as Pooja is biased in her own archival rendering of the story Lives of the People. Isn't that dangerous to a certain extent?
It's inevitable. You know, it's inevitable. Even actually, John and I have been working at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, so we know what we're working on similar materials. But even in an archive as in Austin, there's been a librarian who has catalogued the archive and has catalogued the archive in a certain way. So actually, the way we find the archive is already, you know, organized in a certain way that may show the presence of the librarian, but also maybe the presence of the writer. I've been working on the archives of Kazuo Ishiguro, and he himself made a selection. He himself classified his papers in a certain order. He added, yellow sticky paper to explain things. So of course he is creating a narrative of his own archive. And then my work as an academic might be to create a different narrative, of course. And yes, depending on the topic we're working about, that can be dangerous because you can create a narrative from that archive. You can decide which archive you select, of course, and which you do not select. And that's what Boaventura de Sousa Santos says, that an archive is also about what is not in the archive. What hasn't been selected in the archive is also part of the archive. We need to be aware of what hasn't been included in the archive.
Particularly when the archive is scattered in several different sites.
Yes.
And they catalog things differently. And
yes, absolutely.
So you're not just dealing with one, you're dealing with a massive amount.
Yes. And then, writers do not give all their archives. I'm also working on the archives of Julian Barnes, and he has kept a lot of material at his home. So whenever I go to his home, I see all these notebooks, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's so much left. So, and I don't know what he'll do with this material. So, the idea that we might have a complete archive is a utopia, of course. Yes. Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. It was, as always, daunting. I wanted to. I've read Diana Taylor a bit. I'm still trying to come to terms with the fact that a performance could be there as an archive. I mean, I don't want to ask the silly question, well, it wasn't recorded, so it's not an archive. It's not my question. What I mean is that by definition, a performance has to do with, impermanence. So don't you, how do you come to grasp with the fact that we want to keep a trace, right? What sort of mad, sad, obsession would that be, if you see what I mean? Of course, a performance is going to resonate long after it has happened, but the point is precisely to get rid of that inscription in temporality.
That's true, and that's why, I'm still struggling with this notion of the archive, but that's why we need to redefine the archive, and even the archive in the singular can mean different things. So in terms of a performance, it might just be the memory that you have in your head. And so how is that an archive? It might be an archive just for you, and not for anybody else, because your experience of the performance is not the same as the experience of the person next to you. So what is that value of the archive? It might only be a value for you, So it all has to do with how we define the archive.
But then it means that you're giving away with the idea that an archive is public or is collective. I think there's also a part of the definition of the archive, or the definitions in the plural that we that we can come up with have to do with togetherness, right? So an individual archive, where
yes, of course, doesn't have the same
but
function.
Of course,
yes.
Also a performance is not for one individual. So you could
yes,
also,
yes. But it can be an experience as well. Boaventura de Sousa Santos says that a lived experience can also be an archive. That's why, at some point the definition becomes huge. And I liked what you said as well, that it's okay to let go as well. There are certain events that we may have experienced, and it's not everything has to be archived. So yes.
Vanessa again.